Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back to economy class where you belong. The words cut through the first-class cabin like a blade, delivered with such casual cruelty that nearby passengers froze mid-conversation. The flight attendant's manicured finger pointed dismissively at a woman in simple jeans and a comfortable sweater, her natural hair pulled back in an understated ponytail. What the crew didn't know was that this unassuming passenger owned 47% of the very airline they worked for. In less than 10 minutes, their careers would be over, and their arrogance would cost them everything they'd worked for. Dr. Amara Williams had built Sky Vista Airlines from a single regional route into one of the nation's most respected carriers. But success hadn't changed her. While other executives traveled with entourages and designer luggage, she preferred simplicity. Today, she was returning from a quiet weekend visiting her elderly mother, dressed comfortably for the flight home. She'd deliberately booked under her maiden name, Williams, rather than her well-known married name that graced the company letterhead. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from seeing your organization through ordinary eyes. The lead flight attendant, Jessica Manning, stood with her arms crossed, blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her severe expression. 28 years old, with 5 years at Sky Vista. She'd cultivated a reputation for maintaining what she called cabin standards. To her, that meant ensuring certain types of passengers knew their place. Her colleague, Derek Santos, smirked from behind the galley curtain, clearly enjoying the show. They'd done this dance before, with passengers they deemed unworthy of premium service. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Amara said quietly, her voice steady, despite the heat rising in her chest. She reached into her purse for her boarding pass, the first-class ticket she'd legitimately purchased, but Jessica waved it away without even looking. Honey, I don't care what piece of paper you're waving around. This section is for our premium customers, people who understand the value of the experience we provide. Jessica's voice carried that particular blend of condescension and authority that came from years of small-scale power trips. She glanced around the cabin, making sure other passengers were watching. This wasn't just about removing one person. It was about sending a message. A businessman in seat 2A lowered his newspaper, frowning at the exchange. An elderly couple in row 3 exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the subtle discrimination that could be explained away later. This was brazen, public, and undeniably wrong. But Jessica Manning had made these calculations before. She knew that most people would stay silent, unwilling to get involved in someone else's confrontation. Amara felt the familiar weight of a moment she'd experienced too many times in her 53 years. The assumption that her presence in certain spaces was a mistake. The casual dismissal of her right to occupy premium seats she'd paid for. The effortless ways some people could look at her and see only what they expected to see, never imagining that the quiet woman in comfortable clothes might be the person who signed their paychecks. Derek stepped forward, emboldened by his colleagues' performance. Look, we're trying to be nice about this, but if you don't move voluntarily, we'll have to call security. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. His tone carried the practiced threat of someone who'd learned to wield authority like a weapon. At 26, he'd been with the airline for 3 years. Long enough to feel untouchable, but not long enough to understand the consequences of his actions. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pulling out phones, others simply staring. This was the kind of incident that could explode across social media within minutes. But Jessica and Derek seemed oblivious to the scrutiny. They were focused on their immediate goal, asserting dominance over someone they perceived as powerless. Amara took a slow breath, her business mind already working through the implications of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just about her personal experience anymore. This was about the culture she'd unknowingly allowed to fester within her own company. The way her employees treated customers when they thought no one important was watching. The casual racism and classism that had somehow taken root despite all her efforts to build an inclusive organization. She could reveal her identity right now. Watch their faces change from arrogance to terror in an instant. But something told her to wait, to see how far they'd push this, to understand the full scope of the problem she was dealing with. Sometimes you had to let people show you exactly who they were before you could decide what to do about it. "I'll wait for the captain," Amara said simply, settling back into her seat with the patience of someone who knew that justice, while sometimes delayed, was absolutely inevitable. The captain's arrival only emboldened Jessica's resolve. Captain Mark Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit with the swagger of someone accustomed to absolute authority within his metal kingdom. 45 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair, he'd been flying for Sky Vista for 12 years. His reputation among the crew was legendary, not for his piloting skills, which were adequate, but for his unwavering support of flight attendants who maintained what he called proper cabin discipline. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of manufactured authority as his eyes swept dismissively over Amara. He didn't wait for her response before turning to Jessica, his expression already signaling whose side he was on. "This wasn't an investigation, it was a performance. Captain, this passenger is refusing to move to her appropriate seating assignment," Jessica explained, her voice taking on a professional tone that barely masked her satisfaction. "She's become disruptive and is disturbing our premium customers." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that several passengers actually looked around, confused, having witnessed no disruption beyond the crew's own behavior. Amara watched this choreographed deception with the analytical mind that had built her empire. She recognized the system at work here. The automatic credibility given to uniformed authority, the assumption that the customer must be wrong, the casual deployment of coded language designed to justify predetermined conclusions. This wasn't incompetence. This was institutional discrimination, operating exactly as designed. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to comply with my crew's instructions," Rodriguez said, his tone carrying the finality of someone who'd never had his decisions questioned. "If you continue to refuse, we'll have no choice but to contact airport security and have you removed from the aircraft entirely." The businessman in 2A had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Margaret Chen, a retired teacher traveling to visit her grandchildren, found herself gripping her purse handles tighter as she watched the injustice unfold. In seat 1C, tech entrepreneur James Washington pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable silence to collective unease. Derek, sensing an opportunity to impress his superiors, stepped closer to Amara's seat. "Look, lady, we're trying to help you save face here. Just gather your things and walk back to economy before this gets embarrassing." His voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who'd learned to enjoy the power that came with his uniform. At 26, he'd never owned anything more valuable than his car, but in this moment, he felt like a king dispensing justice to his subjects. Amara's internal calculator was working overtime. Every word, every gesture, every assumption was being cataloged and analyzed. She thought about the sensitivity training she'd mandated company-wide just 6 months ago, the diversity and inclusion initiatives she'd personally championed, the carefully crafted mission statement that hung in every Sky Vista facility, promising respect and dignity for every passenger, all of it meaningless when filtered through the prejudices of people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. "I understand your position," Amara said, her voice remaining maddeningly calm. "But I'd like to see the specific policy that requires me to move based on your assessment of my appearance." Her question was delivered with the precision of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms, cutting through rhetoric to expose the hollow core of weak arguments. Jessica's confidence wavered for a microsecond before reasserting itself. We don't need to justify our policies to passengers who can't follow basic instructions. This is about maintaining standards. The circular logic was breathtaking in its audacity. We're removing you because you don't belong, and you don't belong because we're removing you. Margaret Chen had heard enough. A woman who'd spent 40 years teaching middle school students about justice and fairness couldn't remain silent any longer. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice trembling but determined. "But I've been watching this entire interaction, and this lady has done absolutely nothing wrong. She's been nothing but polite while you've been incredibly rude." Rodriguez turned his authoritative glare toward Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay out of this situation. We have everything under control." His tone carried the implied threat that she could be next if she continued to interfere with his crew's authority. But Margaret's intervention had broken the spell of silence. James Washington finally pressed record, the small red dot on his phone screen capturing everything. The elderly couple in row 3 were whispering urgently to each other. Other passengers were starting to shift uncomfortably, some pulling out their own phones. Derek noticed the phones and felt a flicker of uncertainty. He'd dealt with difficult passengers before, but this felt different. The crowd was turning, and social media had a way of making private incidents very public very quickly. But Jessica's confidence was infectious, and Rodriguez's authority seemed absolute. They were in charge here. They were the ones with the power. "Sir, if you don't put that phone away, you'll be joining her in economy," Derek warned James, pointing at the recording device. The threat was hollow. Passengers had every right to record in public spaces, but it was delivered with the conviction of someone who'd never had his authority challenged. Amara observed this escalation with the detached fascination of a scientist watching a particularly interesting experiment. She was seeing her company's culture, in its rawest form, stripped of the corporate polish and diversity statements. This was what happened when people thought nobody important was watching. This was what her passengers experienced when she wasn't there to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent millions on customer service training, millions more on sensitivity programs, and yet here were her employees, operating as if none of that had ever happened. They weren't just discriminating against her. They were actively threatening other passengers who dared to speak up for what was right. Rodriguez checked his watch with the impatience of someone whose authority had been questioned for far too long. "Ma'am, you have 30 seconds to gather your belongings and move, or I'm calling security. This conversation is over." But for Amara Williams, the conversation was just beginning. James Washington's phone wasn't the only one recording anymore. The threat to confiscate devices had backfired spectacularly, triggering exactly the kind of collective resistance that social media had taught passengers to deploy. Within seconds, at least 6 phones were discreetly positioned to capture every angle of the unfolding drama. The crew had transformed a private discrimination incident into a very public spectacle, and modern technology was ensuring that every word would be preserved forever. Sarah Martinez, a social media manager traveling for work, had already uploaded her first clip to Twitter with the caption, "Watching blatant discrimination unfold on at Sky Vista Air, Flight 447. This is absolutely disgusting. Hashtag Sky Vista Scandal, hashtag Airline Discrimination." The video showed Jessica's smug expression as she dismissed Amara's boarding pass without even looking at it. Within minutes, the post had 17 retweets and 34 angry reactions. The viral machinery was already in motion. Sarah's followers were sharing the clip to their networks, each adding their own outraged commentary. Hashtag SkyVista began trending in regional feeds as more passengers from the flight found the original post and added their own footage. The airline's social media team, blissfully unaware of the crisis brewing at 30,000 feet, continued posting cheerful, promotional content about their commitment to exceptional service. Margaret Chen, emboldened by the support she saw building around her, stood up from her seat. At 72 years old, she'd lived through enough history to recognize injustice when she saw it, and she'd taught enough students about moral courage to know when it was time to act. "This is absolutely shameful," she announced to the cabin, her retired teacher's voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in classrooms. "This woman has done nothing wrong, and you're treating her like a criminal." Derek's face flushed red as he realized the situation was slipping beyond their control. The phones, the standing passenger, the murmurs of agreement rippling through the cabin. None of this was part of his usual script. "Ma'am, sit down immediately, or you'll be removed as well," he snapped, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying his growing uncertainty. Dr. Michael Stevens, a civil rights attorney, traveling to a conference, couldn't remain silent any longer. "As an officer of the court, I need to inform everyone here that what we're witnessing appears to be a clear violation of federal anti-discrimination laws." His deep voice carried the weight of legal authority as he addressed the cabin. "I strongly encourage everyone to continue documenting this incident, as it may be relevant in future legal proceedings." Rodriguez felt his authority crumbling with each new voice of opposition. This was supposed to be simple: one problematic passenger removed, order restored, flight continuing on schedule. Instead, he was facing what looked like a passenger revolt, and the phones meant this disaster would follow him far beyond this flight. But his ego wouldn't allow him to back down now. "Anyone who continues to interfere with crew operations will be met with the full legal consequences," he announced, his voice rising to compete with the growing discord. The businessman in 2A introduced himself as David Kim, a marketing executive with over 1 million LinkedIn followers. He was already crafting his post, currently witnessing the most blatant case of airline discrimination I've ever seen. The crew is literally trying to remove a paying first-class passenger based solely on her appearance. This is 2024, not 1964. Absolutely unacceptably. His post would eventually reach his entire professional network, including several journalists and civil rights advocates. Jessica, realizing that her moment of authority was becoming a nightmare of accountability, doubled down with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged in real time. "This passenger purchased an economy ticket and is trying to scam her way into first class. We're protecting the rights of our legitimate premium customers." The lie was bold and easily disprovable, but she was banking on the assumption that authority figures were still automatically believed over ordinary passengers. But the digital age had changed those rules fundamentally. Within minutes, passenger Amanda Foster had used the airplane's Wi-Fi to check Amara's seat assignment through the airline's own app. "I just verified her seat assignment online," she announced to the cabin, holding up her phone screen. "She's legitimately assigned to seat 1B. The crew is lying." The revelation sent a wave of angry murmurs through the first-class section. The documentation was becoming overwhelming. Every angle was covered, every lie was being fact-checked in real time, and every moment of crew misconduct was being preserved for posterity. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It was becoming a case study in how quickly institutional discrimination could be exposed and held accountable in the digital era. Tyler Brooks, a college student with a popular TikTok account, was already editing clips for maximum viral impact. His first post, showing the stark contrast between Amara's calm dignity and the crew's aggressive hostility, was designed to trigger the platform's algorithm for social justice content. The caption read, "POV, you're witnessing exactly why we still need to fight racism in 2024. This is happening right now on my flight. #racism, #discrimination, #viral." Rodriguez made one final attempt to regain control. "All passengers need to put away recording devices immediately and return to your seats. This is a direct order from your captain." But his words fell on deaf ears. The passengers had tasted the power of collective action, and they weren't backing down. Social media was no longer just documenting the incident, it was actively shaping it. The crew found themselves performing not just for the passengers front of them, but for the thousands of viewers who would judge their actions within hours, and they were failing that performance catastrophically. The viral storm was building, and there was no stopping it now. Amara reached into her purse with the deliberate calm of someone who had just made a decision that would change everything. Her fingers found her phone, not the regular iPhone that most passengers carried, but a secure device that connected directly to SkyVista's executive communications network. The crew was so focused on their performance of authority that they failed to notice the subtle shift in her demeanor, the transition from passive observer to active strategist. "I think it's time I made a phone call," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying a new undertone that made several passengers lean forward. There was something different about the way she held herself now, a confidence that seemed to emerge from some deep reservoir of power that the crew had completely failed to recognize. Jessica rolled her eyes with theatrical exaggeration. "Oh, here we go. Let me guess. You're calling your lawyer? Your husband? Maybe the president?" Her sarcasm drew chuckles from Derek, who was clearly enjoying what he saw as the passenger's last desperate gambit. "Lady, I don't care if you call God himself. You're not staying in first class." But Amara was already dialing, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who had made similar calls countless times before. The number she pressed wasn't for a lawyer or a complaint hotline. It was the direct line to SkyVista's chief operating officer, a man who would recognize her voice instantly and understand exactly what kind of crisis was unfolding. "Marcus, it's Amara," she said when the call connected, her voice carrying across the cabin with crystal clarity. "I need you to pull up the passenger manifest for Flight 447 from Denver to Seattle, check seat 1B. There was something in her tone, not the desperation of a frustrated passenger, but the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that moved mountains. Rodriguez laughed, actually laughed, at what he perceived as an elaborate bluff. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you're fooling, but these Hollywood theatrics aren't going to work on my aircraft. You can call anyone you want, the result is going to be the same." The passengers, however, were beginning to sense something the crew had missed entirely. The way she held the phone, the casual mention of accessing passenger manifests, the name Marcus spoken with the familiarity of someone who dealt with executives regularly. These weren't the actions of someone playing a desperate game of pretend. Derek stepped closer, his young face twisted with the particular cruelty of someone who thought he was witnessing a pathetic performance. "You know what I love about passengers like you? You think you can intimidate us with fake phone calls and made-up connections. But we see through this act every single time." Amara continued her conversation as if Derek hadn't spoken. "Marcus, I also need you to immediately review the personnel files for Captain Mark Rodriguez, Flight Attendant Jessica Manning, and Flight Attendant Derek Santos. Pull their employment history, training records, and any previous passenger complaints." Her voice remained steady, professional, the tone of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. The specificity of her requests sent a chill through the cabin. She wasn't just mentioning their names. She was reciting them with the precision of someone who had access to detailed employee records. Margaret Chen gripped her armrest tighter, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Jessica's confidence wavered for just a moment before she rallied with forced bravado. "Anyone can look up crew names from the safety announcement, honey. You're not impressing anyone with this little show." But there was something hollow in her voice now, a slight tremor that suggested her certainty was beginning to crack. "And, Marcus," Amara continued, her voice growing colder with each word, "I want you to prepare immediate termination paperwork for all 3 crew members, effective the moment this aircraft touches down." The casualness with which she discussed ending careers sent ripples of shock through the first class cabin. Rodriguez felt his first genuine moment of uncertainty. The passenger's composure was unnerving, her detailed knowledge of airline operations suspicious, but his ego refused to process what his instincts were beginning to tell him. Ma'am, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but impersonating airline executives is a federal crime. You're only making this worse for yourself. Dr. Stevens, the civil rights attorney, was studying Amara with the analytical eye of someone trained to read people and situations. Something about her bearing, her vocabulary, her complete lack of fear in the face of overwhelming authority. It all pointed to someone who possessed power that the crew couldn't even imagine. Also, Marcus, Amara said, and now her voice carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. I want the board of directors convened for an emergency meeting within the hour. We have a systemic problem that requires immediate attention. She paused, letting her words settle over the cabin like a thunderclap. And activate our crisis communications team. This incident is already viral, and we need to get ahead of it. The mention of board meetings and crisis communications teams wasn't something a random passenger would know to reference. These were the operational details of corporate leadership, the vocabulary of someone who lived in the C-suite world of major airlines. Derek's face had gone pale, but his wounded pride drove him to one final act of defiance. Lady, you can pretend to be whoever you want, but we all know you're just some nobody trying to cause trouble. Security is on their way, and you're going to be arrested for disorderly conduct and impersonating a corporate executive. James Washington caught everything on video. His phone focused on Amara's face as she ended her call. There was something almost serene about her expression, the look of someone who had just set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. Gentlemen, Amara said, addressing Rodriguez and Derek directly, you have about 2 minutes before this becomes very interesting. Her smile was slight but devastating, carrying the promise of consequences that were about to reshape their entire world. The crew stood in their final moments of ignorance, still believing they held all the power, completely unaware that they were about to face the person who could take everything away from them with a single word. The phone rang. Not Amara's phone, the aircraft's internal communication system, the secure line that connected directly to the cockpit and was reserved for the most urgent corporate emergencies. The sharp, insistent tone cut through the cabin tension like a knife, and Rodriguez's face went white as he realized only a handful of people in the world had access to that particular number. Captain Rodriguez, this is Marcus Chen, Chief Operating Officer of Sky Vista Airlines. The voice came through the intercom system, crisp and unmistakably official, reaching every passenger in first class. I need you to immediately cease all actions against the passenger in seat 1B and report to me the moment this aircraft lands. The color drained from Rodriguez's face so quickly that Margaret Chen thought he might faint. Jessica's confident smirk froze mid-expression, her brain struggling to process what she was hearing. Derek actually stumbled backward, bumping into a serving cart as the reality of their situation began to dawn on him. But Marcus wasn't finished. The passenger you have been harassing is Dr. Amara Williams, majority owner and chief executive officer of Sky Vista Airlines. She owns 47% of this company, which means she owns 47% of your jobs, your benefits, and your futures. The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger in first class turned to stare at Amara, who sat with the composed dignity of someone who had just watched her employees reveal their true character in the most public way possible. She wasn't smiling. There was no triumph in her expression, only the sad recognition of how deeply systemic problems had infected her organization. Jessica's legs gave out. She literally collapsed into the nearest empty seat, her face cycling through emotions so rapidly it was almost comical: confusion, terror, disbelief, and finally, devastating realization. The woman she had dismissed as unworthy of first class wasn't just a passenger. She was the person who had built the airline from nothing, who signed the checks that paid Jessica's salary, who had the power to end careers with a single decision. That's impossible," Derek whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. The evidence was overwhelming. The phone calls, the detailed knowledge of company operations, the way Marcus had known exactly where to reach them. His 26 brain was frantically trying to calculate how badly he had just destroyed his future. Rodriguez found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Dr. Williams, we had no idea your ticket didn't show. But even as he spoke, he realized how pathetic his excuses sounded. The boarding pass had been legitimate. Her behavior had been exemplary. They had discriminated against her based on nothing more than their own prejudices and assumptions. My ticket was perfectly valid, Amara said, standing now with the quiet authority of someone who had just reclaimed her rightful place. My seat assignment was correct. My behavior was appropriate. The only problem here was your decision to judge me based on my appearance, rather than treating me with the respect due to any paying customer, let alone the person who employs you. The passengers were witnessing something extraordinary, the complete inversion of power dynamics in real time. James Washington's phone captured every moment as the crew who had been so confident in their authority just minutes before now faced the person who could end their careers with a phone call. Dr. Stevens, the civil rights attorney, was already taking notes for what he suspected would become a landmark discrimination case. In 30 years of practicing law, I have never seen such a clear-cut example of racial profiling and abuse of authority, he announced to the cabin. Dr. Williams, you have witnesses, documentation, and evidence that would make any civil rights attorney salivate. Marcus's voice came through the intercom again, and this time his tone was glacial. Captain Rodriguez, Flight Attendant Manning, Flight Attendant Santos, you are hereby suspended, pending a full investigation. Upon landing, you will surrender your company identification, your uniforms, and any other Sky Vista property. Security will escort you from the premises. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate plea. Dr. Williams, please, I didn't know. I was just trying to maintain standards. I never meant. But her words trailed off as she realized how hollow they sounded. Intent didn't matter when the impact was so clearly discriminatory. You didn't know because you didn't care to know, Amara replied, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of profound disappointment. You saw a black woman in casual clothes and made assumptions about who I was and what I deserved. You didn't check my credentials because you had already decided I didn't belong here. The businessman in Tua, David Kim, was live tweeting the entire revelation to his million followers. Breaking. The passenger at Sky Vista Air crew was trying to remove from first class is actually the CEO and owner of the airline. This is the most spectacular case of karma I've ever witnessed in real life. Hashtag Sky Vista scandal. Hashtag justice served. Derek made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. Dr. Williams, we were just following protocols. We've had issues with passengers trying to upgrade themselves. But even he could hear how pathetic his excuses sounded. The protocol, Amara said, her voice cutting through his babbling, is to treat every passenger with dignity and respect. The protocol is to verify information before making accusations. The protocol is to de-escalate situations, not create them through your own prejudices. Margaret Chen, the retired teacher, began to applaud. It started slow, but other passengers quickly joined in. A thunderous ovation for justice served and dignity restored. The woman who had been treated like a criminal was revealed as the person who had built the very company whose employees had failed her so spectacularly. Tyler Brooks was already editing his TikTok video with the caption that would make it go viral. POV. The airline crew tries to discriminate against a passenger and finds out she owns the entire airline. The plot twist of the century just happened on my flight. Rodriguez stood frozen, his captain's authority completely evaporated. In 30 seconds, he had gone from the person with ultimate power on this aircraft to someone facing unemployment and public humiliation. The videos were already spreading across social media, ensuring that his name would be forever associated with this moment of spectacular failure. Amara looked around the cabin at the faces of her other passengers, some shocked, some delighted, all of them witnesses to a moment that would reshape how they thought about power, privilege, and justice. She had boarded this flight as a quiet observer. She was ending it as the architect of a reckoning that would transform her company forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the cabin, "I apologize that your flight today included a demonstration of everything SkyVista Airlines stands against. But I promise you this, what you witnessed here today will never happen again on any aircraft in our fleet." The crew's reign of discrimination was over. The real leader had finally stepped forward. The aircraft's descent began 30 minutes later, but the real fall had already happened. Jessica Manning sat in the crew jumpsuit, staring at her hands as the weight of her destroyed career settled around her like a suffocating blanket. 5 years of employment, gone. Her apartment lease, her car payments, her carefully planned future, all evaporating because she had chosen to see a passenger's skin color instead of her boarding pass. Derek Santos wasn't faring any better. At 26, he had thought he was building something meaningful, climbing the ladder in an industry he had genuinely loved. Now he was calculating how to explain to his parents why he was moving back home, how to tell his girlfriend why their vacation plans were canceled, how to rebuild a reputation that would be forever tainted by viral videos. Watched by millions, Captain Rodriguez faced the most devastating fall. 30 years of flying, a spotless safety record, the respect of his peers, all of it meaningless now. The aviation industry was small and unforgiving. Word would spread quickly about the captain who had threatened to remove his own airline's CEO based on racial prejudice. His career wasn't just over at SkyVista. It was likely over everywhere. But Amara Williams wasn't finished. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she stood to address the entire first-class cabin, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just reclaimed not only her seat, but her company's integrity. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally thank each of you for bearing witness to what happened here today. Your courage in speaking up, your decision to document the truth, and your refusal to let injustice proceed in silence. These actions matter more than you know." The passengers listened with rapt attention, still processing the extraordinary events they had witnessed. Margaret Chen wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the victory of justice she had helped facilitate. Dr. Stevens was already drafting emails to civil rights organizations, knowing this incident would become a powerful case study in modern discrimination and accountability. "What you saw today," Amara continued, "was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic problems that have infected not just SkyVista, but the entire aviation industry. But today, that changes." Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen. Board meeting convened. Crisis communications team activated. Media requests already coming in. Full damage control protocol in effect. The machinery of corporate accountability was already grinding into motion. But Amara knew that real change required more than just crisis management. As the aircraft door opened, a team of SkyVista executives waited on the jetway, not just Marcus Chen, but the entire senior leadership team. Behind them stood airport security officers and what appeared to be reporters who had somehow gotten word of the viral incident before the plane had even landed. Rodriguez, Jessica, and Derek were escorted off first, their heads down as camera phones captured their walk of shame. The contrast with their earlier arrogance was stark. 3 people who had wielded petty authority with cruel confidence, now reduced to unemployed figures of public ridicule. Marcus Chen boarded the aircraft personally, something the chief operating officer had never done before for any flight. His presence sent a clear message to every passenger. SkyVista was taking this incident seriously at the highest levels of corporate leadership. "Dr. Williams," he said formally, knowing that dozens of passengers were recording this interaction. On behalf of SkyVista Airlines, I want to personally apologize for the discrimination you experienced today. This behavior is completely contrary to our values and your vision for this company. But Amara wasn't interested in corporate theater. Marcus, the apology I need isn't for me. It's for every passenger who has experienced this treatment when I wasn't here to witness it. How many other people have been judged, dismissed, and humiliated by employees who thought no one important was watching? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Every passenger understood that they had witnessed something larger than one incident of discrimination. They had seen the exposure of a cultural rot that ran deep through an entire industry. David Kim was already fielding calls from CNN and major newspapers, his viral posts having reached over 2 million people in less than an hour. The hashtag SkyVista scandal was trending nationally, but it was being joined by broader conversations about airline discrimination, corporate accountability, and the power of social media to expose injustice. Tyler Brooks' TikTok video had exploded to 5 million views, with comments pouring in from people sharing their own experiences of airline discrimination. The incident had become more than viral content. It had become a catalyst for industry-wide examination of how passengers were treated based on their appearance, race, and perceived social status. As passengers deplaned, many stopped to shake a hand or share their own stories of discrimination they had witnessed or experienced. She listened to each one, understanding that today's incident was just the tip of an iceberg that extended throughout the aviation industry. The ripple effects were already beginning. Other airlines were hastily reviewing their own discrimination policies, terrified that their own employees might be caught in similar viral incidents. Aviation industry publications were preparing exposes on systemic discrimination. Civil rights organizations were planning broader campaigns targeting airline bias. Within hours, SkyVista's stock price had actually risen, as investors recognized that swift accountability and transparent leadership often strengthened rather than weakened corporate reputations. The company's decisive action in firing discriminatory employees and promising systemic reform was being praised as a model for corporate responsibility. But perhaps the most significant change was happening in airports and aircraft across the country, as airline employees who had watched the viral videos began to examine their own biases and assumptions. The fear of becoming the next Jessica Manning or Derek Santos was forcing difficult conversations about how passengers were really being treated when corporate executives weren't watching. Amara Williams had boarded the flight as a CEO conducting covert research. She was deplaning as the leader of an industry-wide reckoning that would reshape how airlines thought about discrimination, accountability, and the power of ordinary passengers to demand justice. The immediate consequences were clear: 3 careers destroyed, viral accountability achieved, and corporate promises made. But the broader implications were just beginning to unfold, promising changes that would extend far beyond one flight, one airline, and one moment of exposed prejudice. 6 months later, Dr. Amara Williams stood before a packed auditorium at the National Civil Rights Convention, sharing the story that had transformed not just her airline, but sparked conversations across corporate America. The viral incident had become a Harvard Business School case study, a training module for airlines worldwide, and a powerful reminder that dignity and respect aren't privileges to be earned, they're rights to be protected. SkyVista Airlines had implemented sweeping changes. Every employee now underwent intensive bias training. Customer service interactions were randomly recorded and reviewed. Most importantly, the company had established an anonymous reporting system that allowed passengers to flag discrimination without fear of retaliation. The airline's customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, proving that justice and profitability could coexist. Jessica Manning had found work at a small regional carrier, taking a significant pay cut and working under constant scrutiny. The viral videos followed her everywhere, a permanent reminder of the cost of prejudice. Derek Santos had left aviation entirely, now working in retail and volunteering with diversity organizations, trying to rebuild a reputation that would forever be linked to that flight. Captain Rodriguez had retired early, his decades of service overshadowed by 5 minutes of exposed bigotry. But the story's impact extended far beyond individual consequences. The incident had sparked a broader movement called Seat at the Table, encouraging people to challenge discrimination wherever they encountered it. Margaret Chen had become an unlikely social media advocate, sharing stories of ordinary people standing up for justice. Dr. Stevens had launched a legal clinic specializing in transportation discrimination cases. Even Tyler Brooks had parlayed his viral video into a platform for social justice content, reaching millions of young people with messages about equality and respect. The broader lesson was both simple and profound. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or what assumptions others might make about their worth. Power isn't defined by uniforms or titles. It's demonstrated through character, courage, and the willingness to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Amara's story proved that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or retaliation. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth and the patience to let justice unfold naturally. She had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change, showing that individual courage could spark collective action. The viral videos from that flight continued to circulate, not as entertainment, but as education. They reminded viewers that discrimination persists in subtle and not so subtle ways, that bystanders have the power to become allies, and that accountability in the digital age means our actions have consequences far beyond the moment they occur. As you watched this story unfold, what did it make you think about your own experiences? Have you witnessed moments when someone was judged unfairly based on their appearance? Have you found the courage to speak up when you saw injustice, or did you stay silent? The passengers on Flight 447 showed us that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to use their voices for justice. Dr. Amara Williams never wanted to become the center of a viral discrimination incident, but when faced with injustice, she chose dignity over anger, strategy over reaction, and long-term change over short-term satisfaction. Her story reminds us that true leadership isn't about the power you hold, it's about how you use that power to lift others up and create a more just world for everyone. What's your seat at the table story? Share it in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation about creating a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve.